Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with someone who I just met. His name is Andy Norman, and he is a professor. He works at Carnegie Mellon. He has been a teacher, professor at the college level for, many, many years, close to 20, I think. And I came across him because he wrote a book that is pretty splendid and timely. Sadly, a much-needed book. It is, and I admit it came late, so I haven't gotten through the whole thing, but I got through a lot of it and loved it. So the book is called Mental Immunity, and I'll put a picture up so people can see it. Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind-Parasites, and a Search for Better Ways to Think. And teachers at heart, we are always looking for better ways to think. So, Andy Norman, thank you so much for being willing to give time. And despite our shenanigans with time zones, we made it. So
we did. Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
And so, this book talks about a field that goes by the name, and I don't know if you coined the term, but cognitive immunity. But
Cognitive immunology.
Cognitive immunology. And what is that? And how long has it been around?
So that is my term for a burgeoning field right now. It's the science of mental immunity to misinformation.
Science of mental immunity to misinformation. So maybe everything is metaphorical, but I get that you think of this more. It's not simply a metaphor.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a metaphor because I'm using the term immunity and susceptibility in areas where they're not often applied, and to the extent that I'm stretching word usage into new domains, yes, I'm using metaphor here. But I think it's more than a metaphor, because the deeper you look at how minds resist becoming, scare quotes, infected with bad information, right? So how do we acquire our resistance to falsehoods and, let's say, harmful ideas? Well, it turns out that our minds acquire resistance to bad information in more or less the same way that our bodies acquire resistance to infectious microbes.
Say more.
Yeah, and so it turns out that's not an accident. So you know how we evolved alongside infectious pathogens, right, for millions of years, and as a consequence, we evolved immune systems, which are constantly doing battle with the kind of microbes that might do us harm. Some microbes evade or circumvent those defenses. And sometimes we have to help our body's immune system fight back. So when we engage in good hygiene, we're actually helping our body's immune system do its job. When we inoculate ourselves or administer a vaccine, we're actually teaching the body's immune system how to spot and remove a pathogen that it may not have been able to recognize before that. So vaccines actually teach the immune system what to look for. Well, it turns out that all of these relationships that I've just talked about apply not just to the body, but also to the mind. So our minds have been evolving alongside infectious bundles of information for hundreds of thousands of years. We actually evolved defenses against the kind of information that might harm us. So we actually have something like informational defenses.
And so it strikes me. So some of that is, as basic as, I think you may have said this in something I read or something I saw, hey, do me a favor and, reach over and get me that hot pan off the stove or coal hot from the fire. And no, because we've learned the heat problem. So is it this is why do people accuse you of accuse you is probably the wrong word, but of simply being metaphorical? So like the brain gets diseases and minds get diseases, and is it but how is it helpful to think? How is it helpful to think about the challenge, the puzzle in this way?
In this way, yeah. So I'm actually recommending sort of a two-part shift in the way we think. One is that we, first of all, we're not alone in our fight against mis and disinformation. It turns out we actually have inherited mental defenses that can actually work at a very high level. And if you know that and know how to get the most from your genetic inheritance as far as mental defenses go, then you can get much better at spotting and shedding misinformation. So in just the same way that the science of immunology totally transformed our relationship to infectious microbes, right? Smallpox used to just ravage human communities. And now we know how to fight back, and we've basically eradicated smallpox. So imagine if we were able to pull off the same kind of transformation, but this time in a way that lets us fight back against viral misinformation.
Two things can pop into mind. So one is really, and the other is, we also evolved. It seems that we also evolved to, in many cases, have a fear response to novel groups.
Yes.
Novel people. So
and novel information as well, right?
And that's sometimes we're wrong, right? I mean, sometimes those evolved instincts are, well, this is not a harmful group. I don't have to be afraid of this group. Exactly. And so is it working is this evolution working at odds with one another?
Immunologists call what you're talking about autoimmunity. So when the body's immune system overreacts to something that's not really harmful, that's called an autoimmune overreaction. So for example, when you suffer from hay fever, your body's actually misinterpreting pollen as something that might harm it and overreacting. And what makes you miserable is the overreaction, not the pollen itself. Right? And we can overreact to the xenophobia is a kind of fear that involves an overreaction to fear of otherness, of people of immigrants, of people from other ethnicities. And so those are cases of, so anti-immigrant hysteria is almost like the society's immune system overreacting to a perceived threat. And our mind can do the exact same thing.
And you're suggesting that there are ways to combat this. How does one recognize whether this is a noxious agent or I'm overreacting, right? I mean, because
it's tricky.
It's the same, right?
Exactly. Well, that's in some ways the $1 million question. I mean, I think there's been thousands of years of research in what we philosophers call epistemology, and that's just kind of thinking about thinking and thinking about how we can think better. And all kinds of rules of thumb that come from epistemological research, like listen to your doubts, because they might be teaching you something important. So many people are made uncomfortable by doubt. They prefer certainty. But philosophers have, for thousands of years, been saying, don't be too quick to squash your doubts. They're trying to tell you something important. Now, when I come along in the 21st century and say, hey, doubts are essentially the antibodies of the mind. They're trying to fight off information they think is sketchy. And if you learn to listen to those doubts, not always, you can't treat them as always right, because sometimes some kinds of doubts are misplaced. But if you learn to appreciate your doubts, recognize that they're actually there to help defend your mind from false and damaging information, then you can develop a healthier relationship to doubt, and your mind can start to function better. These are just kind of ancient wisdom translated into the language of immunology and then applied to the mind. And to me, it gives a kind of clarity and simplicity to the whole question of what is it to think well.
Right. I mean, we spoke about this briefly when we had a phone call a few weeks back, but there's that term that has become such it's almost meaningless these days, right? I mean, parents want their kids to think critically or to learn to think critically. Teachers want their students to learn to think critically. People think they are thinking critically, but there's very little granularity or specificity about what that actually means and how one actually does that. And right, so is it your experience, at least thus far, that thinking about this with the model that you've created is a way of bringing some of that specificity so that here's what you can do?
Exactly. In fact, so I actually taught critical thinking out of critical thinking textbooks for about 20 years. And what most critical thinking books teach you, back in the early 90s, I was teaching critical thinking, and I was using one of the best textbooks around. And the textbook says, all right, here's one of the ways you can go wrong. Here's a second way. Here's a third way. And by the time you're done, it looks like there's like 150 different ways your thinking can go off the rails. And then the authors of the textbook say, it's a minefield out there. Now go out and enjoy thinking. And I'm like,
go out and do that.
Yeah, it's like my students we're developing this attitude like thinking looks like a hazardous activity, and I don't even want to do it because you're telling me all the things I'm supposed to not do, but you're not telling me what I should do.
Right.
So the realization that critical thinking instruction is almost in its pre-scientific phase. It's like we've been using this catch-all term for think critically, and it's kind of almost a catchword for the way we educated people like to think. We like to ask questions. We like to examine the arguments. Yeah, fair enough. That's fine as far as it goes. But you ask college professors, what do you mean by critical thinking? Almost everyone will say, oh, yeah, I teach it. And then you ask them, well, what is critical thinking? And they'll give you 1,000 different answers if they're able to answer anything at all.
Well, and how does someone know? I mean, because people who come up with all sorts of wild ideas, bring an enormous amount of thought to those ideas. I literally just had the experience the other day. There's a lot of hot springs around where I live. So there I am sitting in a hot spring.
Nice.
I mean, it's talking really nice, really great. And I'm speaking to this guy, and he was there, used to live there back from Florida, and he and his wife and blah. And it's a normal conversation. And then something came up where somebody said something about since COVID. And we were sort of off to the races. He was absolutely certain it was a total fraud. And it wasn't just it's a total fraud. it's a total fraud because, and all of the becauses that he, had at his fingertips,
Yeah.
uh, they absolutely led, if they were true, it led him to the conclusion that, hey, there's something fishy going on here. And was he not thinking critically? Actually, I think he probably was thinking critically, but based on what? And that is
I think, and I don't have any doubts that this gentleman you're referring to thought of himself as a critical thinker.
Totally.
And let's be honest, he probably wasn't dumb. He might have been extremely well-informed. Some of his information might have been bad information, but he clearly had mastered certain information sources that you and I are largely unfamiliar with. So give him credit for that too. And he was probably asking questions that we don't think to ask. In all of those ways, in some ways, he might be thinking more critically than you and I are. One thing you realize when you study this problem of science denial or vaccine denial through this lens, it is that doubts can spiral out of control. Just as you can be too uncritical, you can be too critical for your own good. You can be undercritical, but you can also be overcritical. If you imagine that critical thinking should take you from a place of naivete to a place of being more skeptical, being highly skeptical, or less trusting, then you're misunderstanding what critical thinking or what a good education should really do. Because we should not be indiscriminately suspicious any more than we should be indiscriminately trusting. That the trick is to be trusting of the right things and skeptical of the right things.
Well, okay, so I'm just poking at that for a second. How do you know how does one know what the right things are? Because we're living, maybe it's always been this way, but we're living in a particularly wacky time when it comes to information, but both the quantity and the it's like somebody let the horses out of the corral and they're just running wild.
Yes.
And everybody's got a point of view. Everybody feels like everybody's entitled to a point of view. Well, hey, who's to say? I think you've brought that up before, even in our brief conversation. Hey, who's to say what the truth? Like, well, wow, or that famous line that we all are sort of living with. It just didn't know it was earth shattering at the moment, but well, those are your facts, but I have alternative facts.
Facts, right?
So how does one swim through that and land someplace? Not even land, know which pathways are worth pursuing.
Right. Well, yeah. So the problem. So philosophers have been asking a version of this question for a long time. It's just like, how do you distinguish reasonable from unreasonable beliefs?
Right.
How do we know when our thoughts are worth trusting, relying upon, and when they're not? And there's long been a hope that you'll find a simple criterion, a simple test that will be applied across the vast variety of circumstances and correctly sort all of the cases correctly. Well, it turns out that's a false hope, because the world is ridiculously complicated, and the line between good and bad information or good and bad ideas is often very hard to determine. Now, our bodies have to solve a very similar problem. Which of the various substances that enter my body are good for me, and which ones are bad for me and need to be expelled? Right? Nutrients have to be welcomed into the body, and pathogens have to be identified and attacked and removed. And there are thousands of different kinds of pathogens. There are tens of thousands of different kinds of nutrients. And so the body's immune system has to become enormously context sensitive. It has to look very carefully at the particularities of individual cases in order to do its job well. The exact same thing is true for our minds. We have to become highly context or situation sensitive, which means paying really close attention to the relevant considerations that crop up in that particular specific moment and giving those considerations their due.
It occurs to me to ask this question. It may not even be a fair question, but have you had instances of conversations where whether it's about, since you wrote the book or otherwise, you're talking to somebody and they're just not buying it. They're coming from a completely different worldview.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
They don't necessarily. These days they don't trust science.
Yes.
Right? Well, science is what got us into this mess, and they're convinced that that's true. And I guess the unfair question is, so you've been at this a long time. How are we doing?
We have not gotten very good at having
so well.
No, it seems like those conversations are harder than ever, right? I mean, how do you dialogue with somebody across the religious secular divide? How do you dialogue across the liberal conservative divide, the Democrat Republican divide? Well, here's one thing to realize. It's not always this as hard as it is today. There have been significant periods in human history when partisanship was greatly reduced, where a sense of common purpose allowed people to get past their stupid ideological prejudices and actually make them open to revising their opinions based on what somebody on the other side has to say. We can bring back that ethos. We can bring back a cultural ethos where we really listen to people on the other side and are willing to respect them and learn from them. And every time humanity makes that shift in the direction of away from being culture warriors and towards becoming co-inquirers, whenever the cultural ethos shifts from us versus them to, hey, we're in this together trying to think it through, and we're really going to listen and learn from one another. Whenever it shifts in the latter direction, society gets more harmonious, better functioning. We make more scientific discoveries. We resolve our differences. Institutional justice gets better. I mean, it's almost like the linchpin undermining civilized society. Learning to really dialogue together well. In some ways, it's the cheat code for a highly civilized society, and we've lost track of that. But we need to get back to it. And number one, and maybe the most hardest thing to learn, is to how to really listen.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's there needs to be some sort of ethical belief in the value of harmonious interaction, in the face of it, especially when you disagree.
Yeah.
And I don't, that's, I live in a place I used to live in a place that was the blue bubble. I now live in the red bubble. And there's so much distrust on both sides. Right? I mean, it's kind of remarkable. It is as if there is nothing to be learned from other. Nothing to be. I mean, in some ways, it's so. It's just. I mean, we used to call it bigoted. It's just like, oh, you like that? You're in favor of that, and
you prejudge people and then discount them, right? Yeah, we need to get away from that for sure. I mean,
but it's a value for for lack of a better way, word, a value for a humanism that seems to be in the rearview mirror. And
I think of the idea that human rights and human dignity ought to be at the center of not just our value systems, but also the way we treat one another when we disagree. Those are central to the philosophy I call humanism.
right.
And there have been outbreaks of humanistic sentiment across the globe at various times in the last 400 or 500 years. And each time it's happened, society has gotten better off. And whenever humanistic sentiments wane, then societies start to become more fractured and more antagonistic and angrier and more bitter. So I'd like to see us relearn how to be humanistically decent to one another. And it starts with just committing yourself to being a good dialogue partner in your next conversation.
Yeah, you
pull off that one simple act and then repeat and repeat and repeat.
You in something I think I read, you quoted, I think it was you know, the something about truth coming from a dialogue between a collaborative dialogue between friends.
Yes.
And you know, I love that. I mean, I really love that. And even when they're not your friends, but to be able to approach it as if you're having a conversation with a well-meaning, someone who is yearning for better, both for him or herself and for you.
Yeah.
Right. And that we're yearning for the truth. We're yearning, and it's, you know, it's a really hard. Well, you said it before, right? There's no silver bullet that's going to
a cheat code, right?
But boy, if there was one, it would be close to that.
I like that. That's right. There's a Dutch historian named Rutger Bregman who wrote a book called Humankind, and he argues that whenever we tend to assume the best in other people, they almost always live up to it.
Mm-hmm.
That expectation. When you assume the worst from people, they almost always live down to that expectation. So expecting the best from people is actually a wonderful way to lead a richer, more meaningful, a more richly social existence. And it's a good way to kind of protect yourself from cynicism and disillusionment, which can easily curdle into nihilism, a sense of meaninglessness.
Yeah, indeed.
So I make a point of remembering that. So the philosopher Plato had a very simple way of formulating this. He said it may not be true that everybody always means what's best. Oh, it's always a good idea to assume that other people want what's best.
Yes, and not just for them.
Right, and I'm not going to say that it's factually true that everybody wants what's best for everybody, because I can think of very particular people who are too selfish to live up to that expectation. But those people are extremely rare, and we should not let them deprive us of the kind of rich interactions we might have by bringing a more trusting and hopeful attitude to our other interaction.
So I mean, I think it's worth saying, maybe it's obvious to you, but you're not simply speaking about rationality, logic, critical thought, and I don't know how else. I mean, there's a role for, this is a question, there's a role for intuition. There's a role for hunches.
Yes.
Right?
And
this world.
Well, and a role for emotions and passions. And that's right. So when so one of the important things we all have to learn is that our intuitions sometimes lead us astray.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's important not to be uncritically trusting of intuitions. But especially if you take time to try to modify your own feelings about things as you go. So when I learn something new, so suppose I expect something to happen and it doesn't happen. I take a moment to just say, my mental model of the world was deficient in a way that prevented me from seeing this coming. I guess I better change the way I think and feel about certain things. And that way, if I take a moment to just adjust the way I feel about things, then the next time a similar situation comes along, my intuitions are likely to be closer to right. Mm-hmm. So people who continually sort of, the technical term is update their priors. If you update your estimation of the likelihoods of things continually adjust them up or down based on whether your expectations are confirmed or disconfirmed. If you do that, then your intuitions will get sharper and sharper over time. And so, yes, intuitions have a big role to play in healthy thinking. We just shouldn't treat them as gospel. And emotions are the same way. Emotions are really important for ethics. And
well, what about the opposite? I mean, what about you spoke about autoimmune and the autoimmune reaction, right? I mean, so are there situations where the truth, whatever that means, is not necessarily the best path in a particular situation?
I like to say I play for team truth. When I'm engaged in a discussion about what's right or wrong with people, I think it's important that both sides try to arrive at the truth together, a shared understanding of the truth.
I share that as well.
But we all know that there are times when politeness requires us to at least bend the truth a little bit. Sometimes you don't tell the full truth to spare somebody hurt or harm, right? Yeah. These are true. And with this, I think, so the following things are true. Truth matters, but well-being matters also. And sometimes you have to trade off a little bit of truth for more well-being or vice versa. And the really hard cases come in when truth pulls one direction and happiness, say, seems to pull another direction.
Right. Absolutely.
But I think it's important to be deeply committed to truth. So here's one way to think about it. Many of our beliefs stand in a certain relationship to evidence and facts.
Right.
And ideally, the beliefs are backed up or supported by the evidence. So think of the evidence as sort of upstream from the belief and helping to shape the belief. But once we believe something, that can have a downstream effect on our behavior, on our actions, which can affect our happiness and the happiness of others.
Right.
So our beliefs can be pulled one way by the evidence and pushed another way by our desire to help rather than harm.
And I mean, obviously, in some fields, the truth is more enduring. Truths are more enduring in other arenas. Mm-hmm. Things change, and then in others, it's. I mean, how do you think about the role of time? Right. I mean, to act in a way that seems best and seems best for whether it's for individuals or for communities and policy, right? I mean, we really did think this was best, but it may not be best down the road.
Yeah, there's best in the short term, and there's best in the long term. There's best for me versus best for all of us. Right. I mean, I think so. This is a question that is really beyond my pay grade. But how many generations into the future do we need to take into consideration? Do we owe it to our distant descendants to consider how our behavior today might impact the seventh generation down? Well, arguably, yes. But I don't know that it's going to affect my choice of dessert tomorrow, but it may affect whether or not I buy an electric vehicle next time I buy a car.
Right. Right. And it may turn out that, geez, who'd have thunk it, right? Hot fudge sundaes are actually better for you than.
I'll defend that view to my dying day, right? If you don't mind, I'll insert a thought here, since you're collecting your thoughts. Just I like to. I'm excited about the prospects of this science called cognitive immunology that we started off talking about, because I think it's going to give psychologists and cognitive scientists sort of new ways of understanding how the mind works. And I think those ways of looking at the mind and how it grapples with troubling information, conflicting information, false information, how do our minds deal with those things? I think we're going to be learning lots of useful things from that science in the coming years. We've already learned a ton that's useful. But even if you're not a science geek like me, you can start to benefit from this nifty new science and start to learn how to sort of manage your own informational affairs in ways that make you less likely to be fooled by, say, scam artists.
Mm.
There are a lot of scam artists out there who want to manipulate you with information into giving them money, into buying something you don't need, into voting against your own interests, into believing a conspiracy that's wackadoodle. A lot of people out there who are getting rich selling bad ideas and bad products, pseudoscientific cures. You got to learn how to spot them, or you'll become a sitting duck.
But isn't that there's the rub, right? I mean, you've got to learn how to spot them. I mean, look, we all watch, read, whatever we do, the news. And if we were being painfully honest, well, I wasn't there, so I don't actually know. So how do I decide where to rest my weight? On whose point of view do I rest my? Do I have to show up to the pizza parlor in New York to find, the Democratic cabal? Do I have to see the smoking gun itself? So how do people make a decision about where to rest their weight? I mean, we see millions of people who get their news from sources that I might think are just like, what is this? Right? Yes. I mean, like, are you kidding me? And so there is that rub. Like, how does a person who wants to make a healthy, a mentally, cognitively healthy decision about
what to believe? Who
am I going to turn to? It's like, wow, that sounds really bad. What actually happened? Who do I go to? And that is a real challenge. And I think increasingly so, because you said it before. I mean, there are so many actors out there who seem to be acting in bad faith, right? Knowing that you're going to go for the clickbait, you're going to go for the drama, you're going to go for whatever it is. You're going to, what's the psychological term, or the term that psychology uses, sort of information bias or something cognitive?
Oh, there's confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, right? I mean, it's like, right? How does one be doubtful enough? I remember reading some essay Foucault wrote years ago. It was like, It's not that everything's bad. It's just that everything's dangerous.
Yes.
Thinking about, where do I? How do I? It's sort of carrying around that inner skeptic, but at the same time, we're being willing to be skeptical even about the things. Skeptical may be too strong a word. Suspicious, curious, wondering about the things that I most believe.
Yeah, and I do think that being curious helps to keep your mind in the sweet spot between trust and suspicion.
Yeah.
So it's easy to become. So think about children who believe in the tooth fairy. They're pretty gullible. They're so trusting of their parents, they'll believe almost anything. Now think of the complete cynic who won't trust anybody because everybody's out to get him, right? Paranoia, naivete at one extreme, paranoia at the other. Both of those are unhealthy. There's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. And the question you're asking is exactly the right one. Where is that sweet spot? I love the name of your podcast, Curiosity Invited. Curiosity, and this is detailed on our Mental Immunity Project website. Curiosity helps to keep your mind in the sweet spot. So does a collaborative attitude. So if you're willing to treat alternative points of view charitably and try to learn from them, don't be too quick to dismiss them. Try to learn from them first. That helps to keep your mind in the sweet spot too. So I actually, some of my friends in the religious skepticism community love the idea of being skeptical. Let's be more skeptical. Let's teach everybody to be more skeptical. And I kind of want to go, well, hang on. It's possible to be too skeptical for your own good. You can be so suspicious that you cut yourself off from all kinds of many of the benefits of trust. Right. The trick isn't to be indiscriminately critical. The trick is to be critical about the right things. And this requires enormous context awareness. It means you have to be present in the moment and focused on the relevant considerations.
Is there reason to believe, reason that is in some ways informed by, for lack of a better way of putting it, research, which may turn certain people off, but that one gets better at this over time, that there's reason to believe that this is learnable, right? I mean, that thing that we were talking about before, critical thinking, and like, what? It didn't go anyplace. But is there reason, having done what you're doing for a while, to believe that individuals, groups get better at this? It's like building a muscle. You go to the gym, you get a little bit stronger.
Individuals and groups can get better at this. That's the good news. But they can also get worse at it. Think about the person who chases, clicks on some clickbait, ends up watching a stream of YouTube videos that convince them that 9/11 was an inside job.
There you go.
You get sucked down a rabbit hole. You can become more and more suspicious. Your fears and your doubts can spiral to the point where you're even less mentally healthy, less discriminating, less in tune with the truth, less able to distinguish fact from fiction than you were before. Sure. With many different news sources out there that you can trust today, it's very easy. It's hard to have faith that our judgment will evolve in the right direction. But people do tend to get wiser over the time if they just little by little focus on conducting themselves honorably and honestly in each conversation they have. Try to learn a little bit from your next conversation. Try to unlearn something that you might have believed mistakenly. Try to let go of it. Just do a little bit of that every day, and gradually over time, your worldview will become more and more discriminating over time. And stay curious, right?
Yes, indeed. Indeed. That's, I used to tell students all the time. I used to tell teachers all the time, look, really what, if you can give your students reason to be curious, right? I mean, that's the best thing to teach them. Well, that and what do you do when you don't know what to do, right? I mean, how does one, you're going to walk into situations that you've never seen before and you don't know what to do. Yeah. So what skills does a person need to have to know what to do when they don't know what to do? So,
yeah, that question is probably beyond my pay grade too. But if you continually revise your thinking to make it a better fit for the evidence, then it becomes easier and easier over time to answer those "what do I do" questions.
Right.
Right. That the more your mental model of the world is an accurate depiction of the way the world really is, the more your gut level intuitions about what you should do are likely to be reliable.
Right. It does seem to have to come down to, people being well-meaning and hoping for the best for themselves, their families, their communities, other people. And you strike me as an optimistic person in that way, and patient in that way.
I have my pessimistic days, but I try to stay optimistic, and I try to remember also that you don't have to expect the best to hope for the best.
Well, Andy Norman, I hope we have the occasion to have a conversation again. Thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation. See, you said the better part of that hour, and we're, almost there.
Here we are. No, that was a pleasure. Thanks for the wonderful questions and for promoting curiosity. I think
indeed.
That's good work.